The convoy of black SUVs moved through the Moscow streets like shadows against the winter snow. Inside the lead vehicle, Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his collar against the bitter cold that seemed to seep through the bulletproof glass. The young captain who had seized power in Burkina Faso just months earlier was now thousands of miles from home, on a mission that could change the fate of West Africa forever. The Kremlin's towers loomed ahead, their red stars glowing against the gray December sky. Traoré's hands were steady, but his mind raced. This meeting had been arranged in complete secrecy, through channels so deep that even his closest advisors believed he was inspecting military bases in the northern provinces. Only 3 people in the world knew where he really was, and one of them was waiting for him behind those ancient walls. The convoy passed through security checkpoints with practiced efficiency. Russian Federal Security Service agents in dark coats watched from every corner, their eyes scanning for threats that might never come. Traoré noticed how they moved, how they positioned themselves. Everything about this place spoke of power that had endured for centuries, power that could crush nations or elevate them to greatness. As the vehicles came to a stop in a secluded courtyard, Traoré's mind wandered back to that September morning when everything changed. The radio crackled with news of Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba's overthrow. The man who had promised to restore security to Burkina Faso had failed, and the people's patience had run out. But what the world didn't know was that Traoré's coup had been planned for months, not days. And the planning had begun right here, in Moscow. 6 months earlier, a man calling himself Viktor Petrov had approached Traoré through intermediaries in Ouagadougou. Petrov claimed to represent Russian interests in the Sahel region, and he had a proposition that seemed too good to be true. Russia was willing to provide military support, training, and equipment to any African leader strong enough to break free from Western influence. All they asked in return was loyalty and access to Burkina Faso's vast mineral wealth. Traoré had been skeptical at first. He was a soldier, not a politician, and he understood the weight of such partnerships. But as he watched French forces struggle against jihadist groups across the region, as he saw how Western powers treated African leaders like puppets on strings, his skepticism turned to interest. When Petrov invited him to Moscow for a private meeting with senior Russian officials, Traoré knew he had to take the risk. The door of the SUV opened, and cold air rushed in like a slap. Traoré stepped out onto the snow-covered stones, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. A tall man in a long coat approached, extending his gloved hand. "Captain Traoré," the man said in accented English. "I am Deputy Foreign Minister Kozlov. Welcome to Moscow." Traoré shook the offered hand, feeling the firm grip of someone accustomed to wielding power. "Thank you for receiving me, Minister. I hope this meeting will benefit both our nations." Kozlov smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I believe it will, Captain. But first, we must discuss certain realities about your position back home." They walked across the courtyard, their footsteps echoing off the ancient walls. Traoré had studied Russian history during his military training, and he knew these stones had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Tsars, Soviets, and now the new Russia had all walked these paths, making decisions that shaped the world. Now it was his turn. Inside the building, warmth enveloped them like an embrace. The corridors were lined with portraits of Russian leaders, from Lenin to Putin, their eyes seeming to follow the visitors as they passed. Traoré noticed the subtle displays of power everywhere, the thick carpets that muffled sound, the security cameras that tracked their movement, the guards who stood at attention with perfect discipline. They entered a conference room dominated by a massive table carved from Siberian oak. 3 men were already seated, their faces serious and composed. Kozlov made the introductions quickly. General Volkov from the Defense Ministry, Director Smirnov from the Foreign Intelligence Service, and Viktor Petrov, the man who had started it all. Captain Traoré, Petrov said, rising from his chair. Welcome to Moscow. I trust your journey was comfortable. As comfortable as it could be, considering the circumstances, Traoré replied, taking the seat offered to him. Your people have been very thorough with security arrangements. General Volkov leaned forward, his gray eyes studying Traoré with the intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. Security is paramount in situations like these, Captain. What we discuss today could determine the future of your country and the entire Sahel region. A aide entered with tea service, the delicate china a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere in the room. As the aide poured, Director Smirnov spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. We have been monitoring the situation in Burkina Faso very closely, Captain. The jihadist threat grows stronger each day, and the French military presence has proven inadequate to address the problem. Your people are losing faith in both the government and their foreign allies. Traoré sipped his tea, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The French have been there for over a decade, and the security situation has only worsened. Our people die while they play politics in Paris. Exactly, Petrov said, his eyes lighting up. This is why Russia offers a different approach. We do not seek to control African nations. We seek partnership with strong leaders who can deliver results for their people. General Volkov pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. Inside this file, you will find detailed intelligence about jihadist operations in your region. We know their supply routes, their funding sources, their leadership structure. This information alone could save thousands of lives. Traoré's pulse quickened. Intelligence was the key to winning any conflict, and if the Russians really had this level of detail about terrorist operations, it could change everything. But he also knew that such gifts came with prices that weren't always immediately apparent. What would Russia expect in return for this intelligence? He asked directly. Director Smirnov smiled for the first time since the meeting began. We appreciate directness, Captain. Russia would expect several things. First, we would need guaranteed access to certain mining concessions in Burkina Faso. Second, we would need permission to establish a limited military presence to support our advisory mission. Third, we would need your commitment to gradually reduce French influence in your country. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Traoré understood that this was the moment of truth. Everything that happened after this would be a consequence of the decision he made in the next few seconds. How limited would this military presence be? He asked. General Volkov opened the folder and pulled out a map of West Africa. Red dots marked locations across the Sahel region. We are proposing a comprehensive security partnership across the region. Mali has already agreed to host Russian military advisors. Niger is considering a similar arrangement. If Burkina Faso joins this partnership, we could coordinate operations across all 3 countries. Traoré studied the map, noting how the proposed Russian presence would effectively surround the remaining French positions. It was an elegant strategy, using African allies to squeeze out Western influence without direct confrontation. And if the French resist this arrangement? Traoré asked. Petrov's smile was cold. The French are in no position to resist, Captain. Their economy is struggling, their military is overstretched, and their African allies are abandoning them one by one. They will make noise in the international media, but they will ultimately accept the new reality. But that was only the beginning of what would become a complex web of international intrigue. As the meeting continued through the afternoon, Traoré learned that Russia's plans for West Africa went far beyond military cooperation. They wanted to create an alternative economic bloc that could compete with Western influence across the continent. Director Smirnov produced another folder, this one containing financial projections and trade agreements. Russia is prepared to invest heavily in African infrastructure, Captain. We can build ports, railways, power plants, and telecommunications networks. All we ask is that African leaders choose their partners wisely. Traoré reviewed the documents, impressed by the scope of the Russian proposal. Unlike Western aid packages that came with endless conditions and oversight requirements, the Russian offer seemed straightforward. They would provide concrete benefits in exchange for concrete commitments. There is one more thing we must discuss, General Volkov said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. The Americans are already aware of your visit to Moscow. They have been tracking your movements since you left Ouagadougou. Traoré felt his blood run cold. How do you know this? We have our sources, Director Smirnov replied. The CIA has been monitoring communications between African military leaders and Russian officials for months. They know something is happening, but they don't yet understand the full scope of our operations. Petrov leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. This is why timing is critical, Captain. If you are going to move against the current government in Burkina Faso, it must happen soon. Every day you delay gives the Americans more time to prepare countermeasures. The weight of the moment settled on Traoré's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had come to Moscow seeking support for his country's struggle against terrorism, but now he found himself at the center of a much larger geopolitical chess game. The decisions he made in this room would affect not just Burkina Faso, but the entire balance of power in West Africa. What kind of countermeasures are the Americans considering? He asked. General Volkov exchanged a glance with Director Smirnov before answering. Economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, possibly even targeted military strikes against what they would call terrorist training camps. They are very creative when it comes to justifying interventions. Traoré understood the implications immediately. If he aligned with Russia and the Americans decided to intervene, his country could become a battleground between superpowers. But if he continued to rely on French support, the jihadist threat would continue to grow until it consumed everything he had sworn to protect. I need guarantees, Traoré said finally. If Burkina Faso commits to this partnership, Russia must be prepared to defend that commitment against all threats. The three Russians exchanged meaningful looks. This was clearly the moment they had been building toward throughout the afternoon. Captain Traoré, Petrov said slowly, what we are about to tell you must never leave this room. Russia is prepared to provide nuclear security guarantees to any African nation that formally joins our security partnership. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Nuclear security guarantees were the ultimate deterrent, the kind of protection that could make even superpowers think twice before taking aggressive action. You would be willing to extend nuclear protection to Burkina Faso? Traoré asked, hardly believing what he was hearing. Director Smirnov nodded gravely. The world is changing, Captain. The old order where Western powers could intervene in African affairs without consequence is coming to an end. Russia is committed to ensuring that African nations have the protection they need to make their own choices. Traoré stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard where his convoy waited. The weight of history pressed down on him as he considered the magnitude of what was being offered. With Russian nuclear protection, Burkina Faso could become truly independent for the first time since the colonial era. But he also understood that such protection would come with obligations that could bind his country to Russian interests for generations to come. The choice was not between freedom and dependence, but between different forms of dependence that served different masters. "I need time to consider this proposal," Traoré said, turning back to face the Russians. "Of course," Petrov replied. "But remember that time is not on our side. American intelligence agencies are very good at disrupting operations they don't approve of." General Volkov stood and walked to a secure cabinet in the corner of the room. He withdrew a briefcase and placed it on the table. "This contains encrypted communication equipment that will allow you to contact us securely from anywhere in the world. If you decide to proceed with our partnership, use this equipment to send a single word, sunrise. We will take care of everything else." Traoré accepted the briefcase, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside was technology that could change the course of African history, but only if he had the courage to use it. The meeting concluded with formal pleasantries, but everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had shifted. As Traoré was escorted back to his convoy, he noticed that the guards seemed more attentive, more protective. He was no longer just a visiting African officer. He was a potential ally in Russia's global strategy. The flight back to Ouagadougou gave Traoré time to think about everything he had learned in Moscow. The Russian offer was tempting, but it also carried enormous risks. If he moved against the current government and failed, he would likely face execution as a traitor. If he succeeded but the partnership with Russia went wrong, his country could end up as a proxy battlefield in a new Cold War. No one expected what came next when Traoré's plane touched down in Burkina Faso. Within hours of his return, he began reaching out to trusted officers throughout the military, testing their loyalty and gauging their willingness to support dramatic change. The intelligence he had received in Moscow proved invaluable in these conversations, as he was able to demonstrate knowledge of terrorist operations that impressed even senior commanders. 3 weeks after his Moscow visit, Traoré sent the coded message, "Sunrise." The response came within hours, delivered through channels so secure that even he didn't fully understand how they worked. Russian military advisors would arrive in Burkina Faso within the month, disguised as mining consultants and agricultural experts. Advanced weapons and communication equipment would follow, shipped through a complex network of intermediaries that made the true source impossible to trace. The coup itself unfolded with clockwork precision. On the morning of September 30, 2022, Traoré and his allies moved simultaneously against key government and military installations. The intelligence provided by Russian sources allowed them to neutralize potential resistance before it could organize. Within 12 hours, the old government had collapsed and Traoré found himself the leader of Burkina Faso. But the real test came in the weeks that followed. As international pressure mounted and Western powers threatened sanctions, Traoré had to balance his new relationship with Russia against the practical needs of governing a country under siege. The Russian advisors proved invaluable in these early days, providing not just military expertise but also guidance on managing international relations during a crisis. The Americans, as predicted, responded with a combination of diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions. But they also began more subtle operations designed to undermine Traoré's government from within. CIA operatives, working through local assets, attempted to foment unrest in key cities and recruit military officers who might be willing to launch a counter-coup. Director Smirnov had warned Traoré about these tactics, and the counterintelligence measures Russian advisors helped him implement proved crucial in maintaining stability. Several assassination attempts were thwarted, and a network of American agents was rolled up in a series of coordinated arrests that sent a clear message to Washington. Throughout this turbulent period, the encrypted communication system provided by the Russians allowed Traoré to coordinate with other African leaders who were facing similar pressures. Mali's military government shared intelligence about French operations, while Niger's leadership provided updates on American diplomatic initiatives. The network of Russian allied African nations was becoming a formidable force in regional politics. But perhaps the most significant development came 6 months after the coup, when Traoré received an invitation to return to Moscow for a ceremony that would formalize Burkina Faso's membership in what Russia called the African Security Partnership. The nuclear security guarantees discussed in that first meeting would be officially extended, making Burkina Faso the first sub-Saharan African nation to receive such protection from a nuclear power. The second trip to Moscow was very different from the first. Where before Traoré had traveled in secret, this time he flew on a Russian government aircraft with full diplomatic protocols. The ceremony at the Kremlin was attended by senior officials from across the Russian government, and the signing of the security agreement was broadcast live on Russian state television. Standing in the same room where he had first heard the Russian proposal, Traoré reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Burkina Faso was now part of a new international order that challenged Western dominance in Africa. The country had access to advanced military technology, guaranteed security protection, and economic partnerships that promised to transform its development prospects. Yet as he signed the final documents that bound his country to Russia's strategic vision, Traoré also understood that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The nuclear security guarantees came with obligations that would shape Burkina Faso's foreign policy for decades to come. Future leaders would inherit the choices he had made in these Moscow meetings, for better or worse. The ceremony concluded with a private dinner where Traoré found himself seated next to senior Russian officials who spoke candidly about their long-term vision for Africa. They saw the continent as the key battleground in a new global competition between Russia and the West, and they were prepared to invest heavily in African partners who shared their strategic objectives. "You have shown great courage, Captain," Director Smirnov said over dessert. "Many African leaders talk about independence, but few are willing to take the risks necessary to achieve it." "Independence has always required sacrifice," Traoré replied. "The question is whether the sacrifices we make today will benefit future generations or burden them." Petrov raised his glass in a toast. To the future of Africa, and to leaders who have the vision to shape that future. As the evening progressed, Traoré learned more about Russia's continental strategy. Beyond military cooperation, they were planning massive infrastructure projects that would connect African economies to Russian markets. New ports, railways, and telecommunications networks would create trade routes that bypassed traditional Western channels entirely. The scale of the Russian vision was breathtaking, but it also raised questions about sovereignty that would challenge African leaders for years to come. As Traoré flew back to Burkina Faso after the ceremony, he wondered whether he had helped his country achieve true independence or simply chosen a different form of dependence that might prove more costly in the long run. The months that followed tested every aspect of the Russian partnership. Jihadist groups, apparently receiving new weapons and intelligence from Western sources, launched increasingly sophisticated attacks against government targets. The Russian military advisors proved their worth in these battles, providing tactical expertise and advanced weapons that helped government forces maintain the upper hand. But the conflict also revealed the limitations of foreign partnerships. While Russian advisors could provide excellent military guidance, they couldn't address the underlying social and economic problems that made young people vulnerable to extremist recruitment. Traoré found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, trying to provide security while also delivering the economic development his people desperately needed. The nuclear security guarantees, while psychologically important, proved to be less relevant to daily governance than Traoré had initially hoped. The Americans and French were too sophisticated to launch direct military attacks that might trigger nuclear retaliation. Instead, they focused on subtle forms of pressure designed to gradually undermine the government's effectiveness and legitimacy. Economic sanctions, while not devastating, created real hardships for ordinary citizens who had not chosen to be part of a geopolitical competition between superpowers. International aid organizations, under pressure from Western governments, reduced their operations in Burkina Faso. Access to international financial markets became more difficult, forcing the government to rely increasingly on Russian economic support. A year after his first Moscow meeting, Traoré found himself facing a crisis that tested every aspect of his leadership. A drought had devastated agricultural production across the Sahel, creating food shortages that threatened millions of people. The government needed massive international assistance to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, but Western nations were reluctant to provide aid to a Russian-aligned regime. The crisis forced Traoré to confront the reality that geopolitical alliances, no matter how powerful, could not solve every problem. Russia was willing to provide military support and industrial investment, but they had limited capacity to address humanitarian emergencies in remote African regions. The skills and resources needed to manage complex relief operations were still concentrated in Western institutions that viewed Burkina Faso as an adversary. In the end, Traoré was forced to swallow his pride and accept aid from Western organizations, even as he maintained his strategic partnership with Russia. The experience taught him that successful leadership required pragmatism that transcended ideological commitments. His people's survival was more important than proving points about international independence. As his second year in power drew to a close, Traoré reflected on the secret journey that had brought him to this point. The Moscow meetings had given him the tools to seize power and maintain it against significant opposition. But they had also committed his country to a path that would shape its destiny for generations to come. Standing in his office in Ouagadougou, looking out at a city that had survived drought, terrorism, and international pressure, Traoré wondered what history would make of his choices. Had he helped Burkina Faso achieve the independence it had sought since colonial times, or had he simply traded one form of foreign influence for another? The encrypted communication device from Moscow sat on his desk, a reminder of commitments that could not be easily undone. Future generations would inherit the consequences of decisions made in secret rooms thousands of miles from home. Whether those consequences would prove to be liberation or limitation remained to be seen. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou as Traoré prepared for another evening of meetings with his advisors. The work of governing continued, shaped by alliances forged in Moscow snow and tested in Sahel dust. Every decision he made carried the weight of that first handshake in the Kremlin courtyard, when a young African officer chose to trust his country's future to promises made by strangers in a foreign land. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new tests of the partnership that had begun with a single word transmitted across continents: sunrise. The dawn that followed had brought both light and shadow to Burkina Faso, and only time would reveal which would ultimately prevail. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Africa. This is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment.